I never expected that weekend to stay with me for so long, etched in my mind like a scar I can't erase. We thought we were chasing solitude, a quiet retreat into the wilderness, far from the noise of our everyday lives. We didn't realize we were stepping into a place where solitude can swallow you whole. Before I go deeper into the story, welcome, and make sure to subscribe to the channel, Echoes of Nightmares, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on any of the future scary tales. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button too. Also, leave a comment to let me know where you're listening from in the world. Now, back to my story. The first thing I remember about that forest was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind, the kind that soothes your mind. It was heavy, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, listening, waiting. We drove for hours, deep into the backcountry, leaving paved roads and cell service behind. By the time we reached the campsite, the rain had already started, a soft drizzle tapping against the windshield, quickly turning into a steady downpour. It was just the four of us, friends since college, all eager for a break from the routine. We'd done this kind of thing before: pitch a few tents, sit around a campfire, tell stories, and drink until the stars blurred into the night sky. But this trip felt different from the start, though none of us wanted to admit it. Maybe it was the rain that refused to let up, or the way the road seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting deeper into a part of the forest that felt untouched, forgotten. It wasn't until we stepped out of the car that I noticed it. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the rain, relentless, and the occasional crack of a branch somewhere in the distance. I told myself it was just the wind. We all did. Setting up camp wasn't easy in that weather. The ground was soft and slick, and the canopy above barely held back the rain. Our voices echoed oddly in the stillness as we worked, laughing, joking, but not too loudly. There was a strange feeling in the air, one I couldn't quite shake, like we were being watched. It wasn't paranoia, not at first, just a thought that lingered on the edge of my mind, no matter how hard I tried to push it away. That night, as we sat around the fire, it felt like the rain was trying to drown out our laughter, as if the forest didn't want us there. None of us said it out loud, but I could see it in their faces, in the way they glanced over their shoulders when they thought no one was looking. It was subtle at first, that unease, and maybe that's why we ignored it. But looking back now, I wonder if we should have left the moment we arrived. Before the rain grew heavier, before the fire struggled to stay alive, and before the forest began to show us what it was hiding. We were four friends. Jack was the planner, the one who always knew where we were going, what trails to take, and how to make the most of every trip. He'd done his research, too. Picked this remote spot because it was off the beaten path, a place untouched by the crowds. He called it our own little wilderness sanctuary. Rachel was the adventurer, the one who loved the outdoors the most. She carried the energy of someone who was always ready for the next challenge, whether it was hiking the steepest trail or swimming in an ice-cold lake. Then there was Matt, quiet, thoughtful, always the skeptic. He'd been reluctant to come on this trip, but he never said why. And then there was me. I wasn't the most experienced camper, but I loved the escape, the feeling of being far away from the world, disconnected, free. We didn't realize then how completely disconnected we'd become. The campground Jack had chosen was tucked deep into the forest, far beyond any place you'd find on a map. The dirt road leading there was little more than a narrow, winding path, flanked by towering trees that blocked out the light even during the day. The rain made the drive feel longer than it was, the tires slipping on the muddy road, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up. When we finally arrived, the first thing I noticed was how dense the forest was. The trees were ancient, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes, like gnarled hands reaching for the sky. The ground was thick with moss and fallen leaves, and the air smelled damp, earthy, almost decayed. Jack was thrilled, of course. "This is perfect," he said, grinning as he unloaded the gear. Rachel agreed, already pointing out spots to pitch the tents. But Matt hesitated, standing by the car, staring into the trees like he was listening for something. I asked him what was wrong. He shrugged. Nothing. Just quiet, isn't it? He wasn't wrong. The forest was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of the rain and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere in the distance. I told myself it was just the weather, the rain driving the animals into hiding. But Matt didn't look convinced. It was while we were setting up camp that Rachel brought it up. She'd heard something about this area, local legends, stories people told around campfires. They say people have gone missing here, she said, her voice light, teasing, like whole groups just vanished, tents still standing, fires still burning. Poof, gone. Jack laughed it off, calling it typical campfire nonsense. Matt just shook his head, muttering something about urban legends. But the way Rachel said it, I couldn't tell if she was joking or if she actually believed it. I didn't ask. By the time the tents were up, the rain had soaked through our jackets and seeped into the ground beneath our boots. We huddled around the fire Jack managed to start, the flames flickering weakly against the downpour. We tried to shake off the unease, cracking jokes, sharing stories, laughing louder than we needed to. But every so often, one of us would stop mid-sentence, glancing over our shoulder or into the trees. It was probably nothing, just the wind, the rain, the way the firelight danced against the shadows. At least, that's what we told ourselves. But as the night wore on, the feeling grew, like the forest was listening, watching. There was a moment, just before we turned in for the night, when I thought I saw something, a flicker of movement, far beyond the circle of firelight, just on the edge of the trees. It was quick, so quick that I wasn't sure if I'd actually seen it or if my mind was playing tricks on me. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be the one to break the illusion of safety we were all clinging to. But lying in my tent that night, listening to the rain hammering against the fabric and the wind howling through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The forest was too quiet, the shadows too still, and somewhere, just beyond the reach of the firelight, I could have sworn I heard footsteps. The rain didn't let up that first night, and none of us slept well. I lay in my tent, the steady rhythm of the raindrops merging with the occasional gust of wind. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up suddenly. No sound, no movement, just a jolt, like I'd heard something in my sleep, and my mind couldn't let it go. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting weak, orange light across the wet ground. Everything was still, but there was something off, something I couldn't place. I stayed there for a while, staring out into the darkness, straining my ears for anything beyond the rain. I didn't see anything, at least not then. The next morning, we tried to shake off the unease. The rain had eased slightly, but the air was thick and heavy, clinging to our clothes and skin. Jack was the first to notice it. One of the backpacks wasn't where we'd left it. At first, we thought someone had moved it during the night, but no one admitted to it. The bag was soaked, its contents scattered like it had been rifled through. Maybe an animal, Jack said, though his voice didn't sound convinced. We packed up the mess, brushed it off, and decided to explore the area, hoping some movement would shake off the weird tension hanging over us. But as we walked through the forest, that feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The trail was muddy and narrow, winding through dense trees that seemed to close in the farther we went. Every so often, Rachel would stop and glance back, her brow furrowed. "Did you hear that?" she asked at one point. We all stopped and listened. Nothing, just the rain and the occasional drip from the canopy above. "Probably just the wind," Jack said, and we kept moving. But I could tell she didn't believe it. That afternoon, while gathering wood for the fire, I found something near the edge of the campsite. At first, I thought it was a piece of trash, something left behind by another group. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't anything I recognized. It was small, maybe the size of my palm, made of wood and string, intricately tied together in a way that felt deliberate. A strange charm, weathered from the rain, hanging from a low branch. I didn't know what to make of it. Someone must have left it here, Rachel said when I showed the group, but she didn't sound sure. Jack laughed it off, called it a souvenir from a hiker with too much free time. Matt didn't say anything, just stared at it for a long moment before walking back to his tent. By the time the sun started setting, the rain had become relentless, hammering against the tents and masking every sound beyond the immediate area. It was disorienting. We stayed close to the fire, the light barely reaching the edge of the trees. The forest felt alive in a way I couldn't explain, like it was breathing around us, shifting just out of sight. That night it started again, the noises. Twigs breaking, the sound of footsteps just beyond the campfire's glow. Rachel swore she heard low whispers, faint but distinct, like voices carried on the wind. None of us wanted to acknowledge it. We sat there in silence, staring at the fire, until Jack finally spoke up. It's just the rain playing tricks on us. The following morning, we made the discovery. About 100 yards from our campsite, hidden behind a dense cluster of trees, we found it, a second campsite. It was abandoned, but everything was still there. The tents, the gear, even a half-burnt fire pit. At first glance, it looked like the campers had just left in a hurry. But the longer we stood there, the more wrong it felt. The tents were sagging, their fabric torn and stained with mud. Clothes were scattered everywhere, drenched and rotting. Inside one of the tents, we found a notebook. The pages were warped from the rain, the ink smudged, but we could still make out bits and pieces of the writing. It wasn't a journal, not really. More like scattered thoughts, fragments of someone trying to make sense of something they couldn't explain. "They're watching me," one entry said. Another simply read, "Don't sleep. Don't close your eyes." The smell hit us next, faint but unmistakable. The sickly sweet stench of decay, like something long dead was buried nearby. Rachel gagged and stepped back, covering her mouth. "We should go," she said, her voice trembling. Jack nodded, but Matt stayed still, staring at the abandoned campsite like he was frozen in place. We hurried back to our own campsite, but the air felt different now. Heavier. The forest, the rain, even the wind. It all seemed wrong, like we were out of sync with the world around us. None of us spoke as we packed up what we could. The charm I'd found earlier was gone, and I didn't tell the others about it. I wasn't sure they'd believe me. That night, Matt started acting strange. He barely spoke during dinner, and when he did, his voice was low and distracted, like he wasn't really there. At one point, he wandered off into the woods without a word. Jack called after him, but he didn't respond. He came back about 15 minutes later, soaked to the bone and pale as a ghost. "What were you doing?" Rachel asked. He didn't answer, just sat by the fire, staring into the flames. It wasn't until later that I noticed it. His hands were shaking, and his nails were caked with dirt, like he'd been digging. That night, I didn't sleep at all. None of us did. The rain didn't stop, and the noises in the forest grew louder. Footsteps, whispers, the sound of something, or someone, moving just beyond the firelight. I lay there in my tent, my heart pounding, listening to the world outside unravel around me. And somewhere in the distance I thought I heard a scream. The rain didn't stop. By the third night, it was relentless, a constant roar that drowned out everything else. It wasn't just the rain, though. Something was different, more oppressive. The air felt charged, heavy with a sense of something closing in. The shadows around us seemed to shift, growing darker, deeper, swallowing the flickering firelight. That evening, we were huddled around the fire, eating in silence. None of us had spoken much since discovering the abandoned campsite. Every so often, one of us would glance toward the trees, as if expecting to see something step out of the darkness. It was Rachel who noticed at first movement just beyond the firelight, a faint silhouette slipping between the trees. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. We all turned, squinting into the darkness. At first, there was nothing, just the endless downpour and the rustling of the wind. But then I saw it, a flicker of movement, too quick to be the rain or the trees swaying. Someone or something was out there watching us. Jack grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the trees. The beam cut through the rain, illuminating the dripping leaves and the glistening bark, but nothing else. "Probably an animal," he muttered, but his voice shook. None of us believed him. The whispers started again that night, faint at first, blending with the sound of the rain. But they grew louder, closer. They weren't random, either. They sounded deliberate, like voices speaking words we couldn't quite understand. I thought I was imagining it until Rachel whispered, "Do you hear that?" We were being stalked. We all knew it, even if no one said it out loud. The feeling of being watched had become unbearable, a constant weight pressing down on us. Every shadow felt alive, every sound a warning. But the rain was so loud, it was impossible to tell where the whispers were coming from. We were surrounded, but we couldn't see who or what was out there. It happened so quickly. One moment, Rachel was there, sitting by the fire, her face pale and drawn as she stared into the flames. The next, she was gone. We didn't even hear her leave. Jack noticed first, looking up from the fire and calling her name. When she didn't answer, we all jumped to our feet, frantically scanning the campsite. "Rachel!" Jack shouted, his voice hoarse. The rain swallowed his words, carrying them into the forest. We grabbed the flashlight and fanned out, searching the edge of the trees. That's when we saw it, something carved into the trunk of a massive tree near her tent. A strange symbol etched deep into the bark. It wasn't there before. "What the hell is that?" Matt whispered, his voice trembling. None of us had an answer. We called for Rachel again, our voices breaking, but there was nothing. No response, no sign of her. Just the rain and the whispers, growing louder, circling us. Jack wanted to keep looking, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He was shaking, gripping the flashlight so tightly his knuckles were white. "We need to stay together," Matt said, his voice firm for the first time since the trip started. Reluctantly, Jack agreed, and we retreated to the campsite, the fire now barely a flicker against the storm. We didn't sleep. How could we? Every noise, every flicker of movement sent our hearts racing. We sat huddled together, the fire our only source of light, though it felt pitiful against the darkness pressing in around us. At some point, Jack stood up. "I need to check something," he said, his voice flat, distant. "Check what?" I asked, but he didn't answer. He grabbed the flashlight and walked toward the trees, his silhouette disappearing into the rain. "Jack, wait," I called, scrambling to my feet. But by the time I reached the edge of the campsite, he was gone. I don't know how long we waited. Minutes? Hours? It felt like an eternity. And then we heard it, a scream, sharp and piercing, cutting through the storm. It came from deep within the forest, somewhere far beyond where Jack had disappeared. Matt and I froze, staring at each other, our faces pale with fear. "We need to go," Matt said, his voice barely audible. "Now." But as we turned to leave, something stopped us. Another symbol, carved into the tree directly behind the fire. This one was fresh, the bark still wet and raw. I felt a chill run down my spine. Whatever had taken Rachel and Jack wasn't done, and we were next. I don't know how we found the strength to run. The storm was unrelenting, the rain blinding, turning the ground into a swamp that sucked at our boots. Matt was ahead of me, his flashlight cutting a faint, flickering path through the darkness. I followed close behind, every nerve screaming that something was chasing us, that if I turned around I wouldn't live to see what it was. We ran for what felt like hours, deeper into the forest, our breaths ragged, our legs burning. But no matter how far we went, the whispers followed us. They were everywhere, growing louder, more insistent, a chorus of voices we couldn't understand. Then Matt stopped suddenly, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Do you see that?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the storm. I followed his gaze and froze. Ahead of us, through the sheets of rain, a figure stood. It wasn't moving, just standing there watching us. The light from Matt's flashlight barely touched it, as if the darkness around it was thicker somehow. "We have to keep going," I whispered, grabbing Matt's arm. But he didn't move. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. I pulled harder, and finally, he snapped out of it, stumbling after me as we turned and ran in the opposite direction. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, and for a moment, I was sure we wouldn't make it. But then we saw it, a dim light cutting through the rain. A ranger station. The sight of it felt unreal, like a mirage in the desert. We burst through the door, slamming it shut behind us, and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The ranger looked up from his desk, startled. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice calm, almost too calm. We tried to explain, tripping over our words, describing the campsite, the whispers, the carvings, the thing we'd seen in the forest. But the more we talked, the more his expression changed, from confusion to disbelief, then something else. Something like fear. "Wait," he said, holding up a hand. "What campsite did you say you were at?" "Site 12, Matt answered, his voice trembling. "Deep in the forest, near the old logging road." The ranger's face went pale. "That site's been closed for years," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "After, what happened?" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Didn't anyone warn you?" Before we could ask what he meant, he stood and went to the radio, speaking quickly and quietly to someone on the other end. We didn't wait to find out who. We just wanted to leave. As he called for backup, we sat in silence, staring out the window at the rain. For the first time, it felt empty. The whispers were gone, but the unease wasn't. We left the station at dawn, escorted by a search team who promised to investigate. They found nothing. No campsite, no carvings, no signs of Rachel or Jack. Just the forest, drenched and silent. We drove home in silence, too tired to speak, too haunted to try. It wasn't until we unpacked our bags that I found it. The diary, the one from the abandoned campsite, the one we'd left behind. It was sitting at the bottom of my bag, its cover damp but intact, the pages as cryptic and eerie as I remembered. I don't know how it got there. I don't know what it means. But every time I close my eyes, I hear the whispers again, faint but unmistakable. I don't think this is over. I don't think it will ever be over. Maybe you'll sleep tonight. Maybe you won't. But if you hear whispers in the rain, don't listen. Don't look. Just stay where you are. If you want more stories like this to keep you company on stormy nights, stories that crawl into the corners of your mind and stay there, don't forget to subscribe. Who knows what you'll find next time? Something even darker, perhaps? Something that won't let you sleep? Remember, not all stories end when the lights go out. Sometimes, they follow you into your dreams. Stay with us if you dare.